Carissa, welcome everyone. It's just really fantastic to see you all here for what we're calling an evening, a celebration of recovery. And I know many of you have met David already this week, and I'll just say something about that. But it's just so good to see so many people, people that we've known recently and some people who we've known for many, many years, and some people even 40 years. So just brilliant to see folk here. So I first met David in the early 2000s. And as many of you will know, we then disappeared. David disappeared to the other side of the world. He was living in South Wales at that point in time and then disappeared to Australia. And many of you will know that in the last 3 or 4 years, David and I started talking with each other a lot. We got involved in doing a kind of unfunded project on the sly called Recovery Voices, and I know some of you have seen it. Okay, away they go.
Wow, it's great to be here, really. And first of all, thanks to Wolf and James for organising this, and Wolf and Mel for putting me up, being so kind. Yeah, I've been following this place for a while, and I'm just wowed with what's happening. And just so good to be here. I was here in October 2022, but him over there was following Man City, so I didn't get to meet him. But I was in yesterday, and it was just so good. And thank you all of you that were there yesterday. So, quick introduction. That is me when I used to work at the University of Swansea. That's Rosilly Down on Gower, which I call my heart place. Even though I love Western Australia, Gower is my heart place. So what I'm going to do is run through a bit of my journey. It's my reflections on recovery, people who have inspired me, and then there's a couple of topics relating to trauma, which we spoke a lot about yesterday. And I can't fit everything in, so the trauma's a bit less. There'll be something about connection. And in the second part, I'm going to tell you an Aboriginal children's story, which is very related to connection. And it's really good to see Simon Jenkins. I haven't seen Simon in 15 years, and I had no idea he was going to be here. So there we go. Actually, when I was at university, for some reason, I wanted to help people. No idea why. But I had to make a choice, clinical psychology or neuroscience, working with laboratory rats. And I thought that understanding chemicals in the brain was where it needed to be. So off I went, did a PhD. And then I was fortunate enough to get a 3-month scholarship or fellowship from France to work with Arvid Carlsson. Arvid Carlsson is a Swede. He's the father of dopamine. He's also the father of Parkinson's disease in demonstrating what it is and how L-Dopa can help it. I spent 3 years with Arvid, the most wonderful of mentors. I then went off to the States for 2 years thinking that I needed to know how the Americans work. And so I went to a very backward country after living in Sweden. I then came back because I won an award, spent 5 years in Reading, building a research laboratory, and then moved it to Swansea. And I had the best view in British academia on the top floor, 9th floor, with windows all around, 200 metres from the beach. And then I started to get disillusioned. Originally, we were doing mental health related work. When you have a neuroscience laboratory, you have to raise a lot of money from research councils and things, and now they were putting everything into addiction. After a while, I realized, what on earth was I or any other neuroscientist doing to help people recover from addiction? I could spin you a good yarn about brain chemicals and addiction, And at the same time, the National Institute of Drug Abuse, which has a budget of $1.6 billion a year and funds neuroscience and related research, came up with these conclusions. As a result of scientific research, we know that addiction is a medical disorder that affects the brain and changes behavior. Well, by definition, it changes behavior. That's what addiction is. Addiction is a brain disorder, as like other diseases such as heart disease. Bullshit. Research shows that when treating addictions to opioids, you've got to use medication as your first line of treatment. Bullshit. And the addiction problem will be solved by scientists and treatment practitioners. Bullshit. I hardly knew any neuroscientists who actually spent time with people who had drug and alcohol problems. But in the late 1990s, I started to visit treatment agency in Swansea, West Glamorgan Council on Alcohol and Drug Abuse. I emphasise this was early 2000s because this is not the Wakada of today. It's very different to when I was there. I want to really make that point. And I started to learn a little bit about what recovery is about. And you know these things, but think of this naive neuroscientist, never really leaving his laboratory until he started to see this treatment agency, learning as I went along. So recovery is something done by the person. I met so many practitioners who thought they were doing the work. No, you do the work. And therefore it's a form of self-healing. People entering treatment have many associated problems. You can imagine in Swansea, a lot of problems there, a lot of people in poverty, trauma, neglect when they were a child, etc. So an holistic approach is required. But also, we've got to take into consideration recovery capital. That is, what resources does the person have, both personally, in terms of their self-esteem or their housing or whatever, social, family support, friends or whatever, people in recovery, and community, good treatment services, or more importantly, good recovery community. So treatment or engagement in mutual aid groups is really about facilitating what the process is within the person, the self-healing. And really what's important is the relationship between the person who's helping and the person who needs to be helped. So I also learned that recovery doesn't occur in isolation. Connection is key, and that's going to be one of the major themes of my talk today. Also, recovery doesn't occur in a treatment office. It actually occurs out in the community, obviously. And people who are coming to WCADA were literally spending no more than about a day a week in that treatment program. That's actually quite a lot compared to some of the treatment places where you went, did you piss, tested, and out you go. So anyway, it occurs in your social environment, as I always talk about, social ecosystem. Now, WCADA emphasised to me hope, opportunity and choice were essential. And so after assessment, people could go off for a medical detox if they had a serious problem with alcohol or benzodiazepines, for example. And they could also access harm reduction service in the statutory service. So there was a link there between the two. Clients who did the actual treatment program, which was very strongly based on Minnesota program, they had to attend free fellowship meetings. So there was that connection, obvious connection between treatment service and mutual aid, and the support provided for family members. And in fact, that was my first piece of research was actually a piece on family research. So, what did I see down there? Who are two people who totally inspired me? Dave Watkins was the community support worker. He connected someone to all the things they needed. They didn't have housing, if they didn't have their benefits. He'd get them to the GP, sort their legal problems. He was an amazing guy. My daughter, who was at medical school, spent a summer working with us, and she followed him around for the day. And another person who was working with me spent a week with him, and they said that every time they're walking along the street, someone would rush up and say, Dave, I'm still clean, thank you so much. And I was in my old local pub some years later, and I was with Dave and Keith, and I was telling someone about it, and they were looking at me disbelieving. So we got up to go, and somebody from the other end of the beer garden came rushing over and said, Dave, I've helped you. He was just an extraordinary man. Keith Morgan, he ran the Domino program, which was all about activities. So they had gardens, an allotment, they did walks, they had cookery lessons and nutrition, gym, all those sorts of things. And he had a band called the WCADA Warblers because he's a very good guitarist. And the connection between them and the primary counsellors as well, and their clients was extremely strong. And I realised then, again, it's all about connection. Then I met Natalie. Natalie's not her real name. I've got a quote here. Once I became addicted to heroin, I did not see there was an alternative to the life I was living. I didn't know anyone who had overcome heroin addiction. She never heard of anyone. She said to me, I could access the internet. I couldn't read anything on it. She said, so if you want to do something to help people, tell our stories. And so my assistant at the time, Becky Hancock, interviewed Natalie. Some years later, we published her long story, and 7 years after that, we published it again. But I love this bit. Her first session, she met someone who was 16 years clean. It was a light bulb moment, she describes it. From that moment on, I didn't feel so alone. For the first time, I was with a group of people who understood me and my addiction, and I understood and related to them with what they were saying. Natalie is now over 20 years in recovery, and I'll be seeing her in a couple of weeks when I'm down on Gower, so I'm really happy about that. I do a lot of reading, that's just me. I love learning about things. And I found this fascinating book, which the American Psychological Association set up, How Clients Make Therapy Work. And here's a large study that was looking at what sort of factors contribute and how much to positive outcomes. The most common is client and extra therapeutic, 40%. So the most important thing is what the client brings into the room. Second is the quality of the relationship between whoever's helping the person and the person who's being helped. Placebo hope expectancy, 15%. The model or techniques, be it accepted therapy, smart recovery, or the fellowship, it's 15%. And this is well known in the mental health and addiction field, the dodo bird effect. All therapeutic techniques are equally effective, better than no treatment at all. So it's not actually the particularly theoretical thing that matters, it's actually being in the group and interacting with people. So, year 2000, I go off to Sweden to see my professor who just won the Nobel Prize, which was absolutely wonderful, celebrating Gothenburg, where we were. I come back and I've just been given a personal professorship, and they invite you for a dinner and you give an inaugural speech. And so there I am. We launched a new news service called Daily Dose, which some of you might know about. And I'm just announcing at my talk that I've just switched field. And so the university, all the mega money it used to get from our research grants, we weren't going to get any more because I'd decided I was going to work in the community. And I set up this organisation, Wired In, and a charity called Wired International Limited, which was all about empowering people and connecting them. I alone can do it, but I can't do it alone. And we used to say empowerment comes from hope, understanding the nature of the problem and the solution, and gaining a sense of belonging. And connection means both receiving and actually giving support. That's very important. So we set out to educate and inform, tell and disseminate stories, conduct research and evaluation, of which we did quite a lot, actually an awful lot. I put this slide in because what actually it does, it just shows the social ecosystem. This is the treatment environment in which you get better. These are the factors of what you have, your self-esteem or your understanding or whatever. Here's your relationships with your friends, families, or maybe people in recovery. Here are the organisations, treatment services, or whoever else you're seeing. There's what's happening in your communities. Are you a very prejudiced, stigmatising community? And here is policy. So treatment services have to abide by the policy. And when I entered the field, there was a UK drug strategy, and that was based on the fact primarily that drug users were committing crime. Tony Blair decided that he would tackle crime, and therefore what he would do is he'd tackle it by getting heroin users onto methadone. So we had a government that was treating addiction as a criminal justice issue, not a health or social issue. Now, I'm going to take you through a number of problems with the treatment system, but I'm going to move at speed because I don't like negatives. Often treated as a medical order with just medical treatments, paucity of ambition. You always hear the chronic relapsing disorder from so many people, lack of hope. Focus on weaknesses and deficits rather than strengths and assets. And I'm a great believer in asset-based community development. Focus on the number of people entering treatment rather than people who were actually getting better. And what you would find is people were coming through the revolving door. So they would come, go away, come back again. Over-promising, treatment works. That's what the Americans did, and in the 90s, they realized they couldn't keep saying that because people were realizing no one was getting better. So now the budgets were being reduced, but UK didn't listen. Then you blame the client that he wasn't motivated enough. masses of bureaucracy, which I understand has increased and increased over time so that people can't do their job properly. So many practitioners and commissioners didn't understand recovery when I was working in the UK. And I worked in the UK between 2000 and 2008 when I moved to Australia. Treatment, of course, can only facilitate early recovery, helping people get off the drugs, not staying off. So many times I heard practitioners were not encouraging people to get support. Practitioners would say, oh, yeah, that doesn't work. And then payment by results came in at one stage and for some services, and someone I know told me that we were told to say the person had recovered if they didn't come back to the office. And now I'm hearing about large organisations hoovering up limited funding. Now, the last time I saw Simon Jenkins, I think, was 2008. Drink and Drug News had the first service users conference. And Paul Hayes, the chief executive of the National Treatment Agency, stood up and said this. And if you don't believe I've got the words right that are in dittos, then Drink and Drug News that's where I got it from. Service users as a group were unpopular with the public, quote, compared to old ladies who need hip replacements or babies in incubators. They are seen as the authors of your own misfortune. There is no way we can hide from that. I think there were 500 service users at this meeting. Substance misusers are also far from a priority in the NHS, as tobacco and alcohol are much greater issues. And finally, drug users are more likely to be seen as a danger to public health, community safety and the economy. And he said, because you are seen as a threat, the government is prepared to spend money on drug treatment. This is so relevant to a paper that I didn't see at the time in the 90s. I didn't see it till a couple of years ago, from Julian Buchanan, who was working in Liverpool at the time, in their structured daycare program in Merseyside. The people they were actually talking with a qualitative research approach. They were socially dislocated, they had poor experiences of education and employment, lack of realistic opportunities, isolated in a drug-using population, and their self-esteem was so low. Now, there's a long quote here, so sorry about this. Don't like having busy slides, but I just wanted to give you Julian's quote. The propaganda designed to deter people from trying illegal drugs by portraying drug users as a deviant enemy has led to a war on drug users themselves. This has resulted in discrimination at every level. For many drug users, the relapse is not attributable simply to the physical craving or a change in motivation, but as a consequence of their frustration at trying to break into mainstream community life and finding themselves constantly shunned and excluded. It's difficult being considered as normal by normal society. At the very time when recovering drug users need assistance and support from the non-drug using population to establish alternative patterns of social and economic life, they are often prevented by the wall of exclusion. And I can tell you I saw a lot of that, because what was happening in those early years, I also had won an evaluation of the tender for an evaluation of the Drug and Alcohol Treatment Fund in Wales for 2 years. So I was going around visiting all these services, hearing actually a lot of disillusioned practitioners. And that's actually where I met Wolf during that. Simon and I became really good friends. We actually helped Claire and Ian set up Drink and Drug News, and then I wrote articles for every copy, an educational article for about 4 years, actually. I'd turn up at conferences and people would come to me and say, hi, David. And I'd wonder where I knew them, and they said, no, it's your background briefings. And I used to talk at the Fed Up annual conference. Simon wanted me to speak out against the National Treatment Agency, and so I spoke out about what I saw. Later on, I got a phone call from someone in Ireland and said, David, I've got to tell you something. A friend of mine works for the National Treatment Agency, and they want you to know you've been named public enemy. He thought I'd be upset. I actually was pleased, because they said I was criticising methadone. I wasn't criticising methadone. I was criticising a lack of choice, and I was empowering people. They weren't really interested in that. So I went off. Noreen asked us to do an evaluation, and I think it's almost 20 years to the day since we did that evaluation. Noreen passed away in December. I visited her earlier than that, And she asked if I'd do another evaluation, and I said, no, we need your story. And she commissioned me to write her biography, and I was writing that biography, and then she passed away. Anyway, this is when I first saw community, real community, when I went to BAC O'Connor. And I called it Recovery Oozing from the Walls. It was fantastic, and I've got to read this quote. During our visit, we noticed the bright colours in the centre, the nice furniture, the pretty flowers, and the way that staff and clients mingled together. I couldn't work out who was clients and who was staff, and there was no hierarchy. And then we had Sarah Vale, who runs Recovery Cymru, who was working with me at Wired In, and I were going to meet everyone, and we went to the room, and it was cram-packed with clients. It's wonderful. The other thing I was really impressed about, the program of trying to teach people skills and tools that enable them to get back into society, or in some cases, into society for the first time. And then they had a person who actually often went out on interviews or helped people who planned for interviews and everything. It was really good to see. The other thing was, and I've always believed this is an important thing about recovery communities, is their impact in their wider community itself, like we have this here today. And Noreen set up, I think around 2011 or 12, Langan's Tea Rooms. That was her maiden name, Noreen Langan. Very sad loss. And I'm actually going there on Tuesday, and we'll spend Wednesday and Thursday with them, and I'll be passing on the films and what I've written about Noreen to her husband and brother. Tim Lighton, I'm one of the most knowledgeable people I know in the field. Tim was working for Action on Addiction, and he set up a counselling degree with Bath University, and I was their first external examiner and also looked at their plans and everything. So I used to go up there now and again and check in all the marking, and Tim would rush in and say, have you finished yet? And I'd say, okay, let's go. And we would just talk. He then introduced me to this guy, Bill White. I'd been in the field for 5 years and I hadn't heard of Bill White. I didn't know hardly anyone in the UK had heard of Bill White, but Tim obviously had. And Bill wrote this amazing book, Slaying the Dragon, which is a history of addiction treatment and recovery in America. He focused on we've got to move to the lived solution and its positive elements rather than focus on the negative, which was the addiction. We've got to have a better understanding of recovery. And he always made the point that libraries have books on addiction, but how much is there actually on recovery? So the recovery approach empowers and transforms people with substance use problems from community deficits to community assets and resources. People like James and Marcus and numbers of you. This focus generates long-term reductions in social costs, but as a side effect rather than a substitute of recovery. And when Wolf and I both interviewed Marcus, he told us how much he thought he actually cost society, and he's not costing that amount anymore. I always loved that bit of the interview. I moved to Australia in 2008, and I came back in 2009 because Action and Addiction and Wired In had organised for Bill White to be here. We had a conference where Tim Lighton, Bill and I were the speakers, and we invited as many of the leading recovery advocates in the country. It was one of the most amazing experiences of my life to be alongside a man like that. And what Bill says at the end of his book, which is really very interesting, treatment will be something that happens in indigenous networks of recovering people that exist within the broader community. The shift will be from the emotional and cognitive processes of the client to the client's relationships in a social environment. He calls that treatment. It's recovery communities. But there's a shift to this sort of thing. So, Wired In those early years, we were storytelling, we were doing lots of different research, evaluating services. We had several websites which were education and information. And there's just some of the people who worked with me. It's Becky Hancock, who worked the first 2 years with me on the national evaluation. Sarah Vale, or Sarah Davies, as she was then in the middle there. Lucy James, who was my absolute star student, worked for me for quite a while, then went off and became a clinical psychologist. And Kevin Manley, who was an ex-heroin addict. They were my key people. Here's one piece of research which is a special one for James. Because you once said to me, David, I'm really interested in the psychological processes that go on in someone's mind as they go through the recovery process. So in this project, Lucy and Sarah went and interviewed 15 women and 15 men in women and men's prisons. They were all long-term crack cocaine and opiate users. The women had a mean of 15 years use. The men had 20 years use. And the factors that came out with these people, they did not understand why they couldn't stop taking drugs, felt they were weak or evil, couldn't trust other people. This is at the beginning of the program. Couldn't be honest with others or themselves, couldn't talk about their thoughts and feelings, etc., and bottled up and blocked out issues. So now they were on this WRAPT treatment program, which I think now WRAPT is the forward trust. So we were basically looking at what happens to them. Now, of course, we can't tell whether they're taking drugs or not. Whether drug use drops, they're in prison. But what we were interested in is the processes of change in their mind. And then we did a qualitative analysis and looked for the major themes. And these are the themes that came out. Firstly, belonging, not being alone, being part of something else. Secondly, socialization, interacting to mutual benefit, but actually being socialized to belong. You can't belong if you don't know how to interact with people. And I'll talk about that in a second. Third thing was learning about addiction, recovery, about yourself, how to change, stop blaming yourself, get rid of your shame and guilt. Support. And the support was their peers, the practitioners. They did get to see their family and they did go to AA outside the prison. All of those things were considered important. And what they impacted on was their motivation to want to change and their self-esteem. So now let's look at this socialization process. And this is a bit of a long thing again. So this is how it went. This is with the women. And this occurred in the 2 weeks leading up to starting AA. So these processes were actually starting without AA on board. The men, it started to happen when they were doing AA. First of all, you get to know your peers and start to relate to them. Trust starts to develop. Then you start to gain a sense of belonging, boost your self-esteem. In feeling less isolated, you start to share your thoughts. By realizing that other people have done bad things, you realize that you're no different. And you're not evil, and your self-esteem improves. Trust increases even further, which enhances likelihood of asking for help and helping others. Helping others is really important. That message always comes through. Becoming more honest with and learn more about oneself, further improving self-esteem and increasing confidence. And every piece of research that we've done in different places, group therapy is always talked about as the big thing. So that's the process of socialization in this program. We spent a lot of time trying to raise funding. Working with FedUp as well, when actually we had these people who developed a very secure counselling online system before they became big. And we had, in Scotland, looked very interested, the Scottish government, and we had 10 regions who were going to work with us, and we put a bid in, and I was flying up and down to see them on my own money, and then nothing happened. We wrote to all the residential rehabs and said, look, if you all put a bid in, you'll have a service you can all use. And it'll have to abide by FedUp standards. No one was interested. So eventually I was getting fed up of academia because to me it was becoming all business and not about students. I see you're smiling. And so I decided to leave, and I got a payoff, and I decided may also use that to pay my people. And so I hired Lucy and Kev full-time, someone else, and Sarah was ill for a while, so we only did for a while. I then moved from Gower to Cowbridge to be nearer to the community that Lucy and Kev were building in Cardiff. And that community is really about, they've got a place to go to in the evenings, a couple of evenings a week, they'd play pool, they'd have group sessions, whatever. I kept out of it because I didn't want this professor thing to get in the way, but every now and again, if there was a party at my place, by that time my partner had left, taken the kids, my kids would come and stay now and again, and we'd have a little birthday celebration, whatever, the guys in that group used to come over. They were very close to my family. We also got involved, we had a very good filmmaker, Jonathan Kerr Smith, and we first of all made a film of Mark Saunders, and then Kevin Manley, which was just, I'm so proud of that film, although all I did was put the money in. And then Lucy and Kev went round to a number of services and interviewed clients of those services, and one would interview and the other one would talk. There were queues wanting to participate. So, Wide in Recovery, it's on YouTube, and I looked at it a while ago. I've never really promoted it, apart from the beginning. Life as a Heroin Addict introduction has got 305,000 views, 155 on part one. They drop off over time, but still, a lot of people have watched it. The people who were involved in that film were so proud to participate in those films. So that was one thing we're doing. We also did some other films. We did a film with Lucy went out and interviewed young kids of about 14, 15 who were using heroin in an area where it was everywhere, and their families and everything. And they talked about it. And Lucy came home to me after the first day and just broke down crying her eyes out. She just said it was so sad. Anyway, we'd been invited to present this film, and the kids all wanted to do it. I think they were a bit older, 14, 15, maybe 16. They all said they wanted it to be shown. We showed it. The audience, it was run by Swansea Drug Project. The audience were deeply moved. Keith Morgan there came rushing to me and said, I knew that girl when she was a baby. I knew her mother before she overdosed. We then made the decision, myself, the filmmaker, and the drug service, that that would never be shown again, because the girls, though they said, you know, you can do it, we didn't want to. We felt that if they had then found recovery and this film surfaced, that we just didn't. It's all right with these old dudes. They were old enough to make that decision. Kev, Lucy and I then started travelling around the country, and the idea was to try and unite these pockets of recovery activity at the time. And my very close friend, and I love going up to Leap in Edinburgh, that's David McCartney, top left. I loved sitting in group there, absolutely fantastic. I was asked by Tim Lighton if I could supervise a project by one of the students at Action on Addiction, Winfred Ellis Owen, the Living Room Cardiff. That's Kevin Martin, Naraf in the northeast of England. He set up a service and he had 50 volunteers and 41 full-time staff, and it started in his living room with 2 or 3 people. A number of you will know Mark Gilman. He took us around to various places in the northwest. Stuart Honour, the Basement Project, and Michelle Foster. What people don't know is Stuart Honour did more research on the drug field than all the universities combined at the time. But he was also in the Olympic rowing team, but just missed going to 2 Olympics. He was the only part-time rower in that squad, and he was setting up the Basement Project and doing research. Extraordinary. And now Michelle is the chief executive. I had been dreaming about building an online community since 2002, before Facebook. I'd read this book and I thought, what a way to connect people. I tried to raise money, no way. So then I thought, oh, well, early retirement money, we'll do that. So I had Lucy and Kevin working with me. I had a whole load of volunteers. I set up some Google blogs, and we started to put all the stuff there while the chap, and in those days, you had to have it built from scratch. There was no buying off the shelf sort of thing. So I had someone building it over months, not my usual person. And then in November 2008, I did my back in, just before I was due to leave for Australia, which I did for personal reasons, moved there. And we launched. Now, Wired In, the idea was to give a voice for people in recovery or in treatment, to encourage practitioners to come along. It was just absolutely amazing. I absolutely loved it. You had to become a member if you wanted to blog. The reason was we needed to protect people. And there was some pretty vicious stuff on there, and I had to show the yellow card and eventually red card to some people, attacking AA, attacking other people. So you could look at it, but if you wanted to participate, you had to become a member. We got rid of this ex-users and ex-users, families and practitioners, just had it all one thing. But the amount of stuff that went on there, so deeply moving. Then it got to the stage people were just using their telephone. So we had to always edit. We had to look at it first, because sometimes people had so many typos, it's ridiculous. So get up in the morning, look at, and now I'm 8 hours ahead of you. So I'd get up in the morning and I'd be looking what's been coming in, do edit. Then I got some, well, initially Lucy and Kev were working with me, but when I moved to Australia and we still weren't getting money, we had a big drive right early on with this, no way. So eventually I couldn't keep paying money out because my money was running out. So I then had some people who were volunteering, etc. But it kept going for quite a while, but this is one of my favorite blogs. One day I discovered the Wired Into Recovery via Google. I read some content, got drunk, and then became very emotional. As I was crying, I started to realize how much I was captivated by Wired Into Recovery. I started to access the website every day and it became a best friend. I was either reading Wired Into Recovery or drinking or doing both. I read many stories and articles about heroin users. These stories really affected me as I discovered that people were overcoming heroin addiction, the hardest drug to get off, or so I thought. Those people had lost everything, family, home, job, money, but still managed to recover from heroin addiction. And here I was with a job and a home, and it was a very good job. She's Australian. If they could do it with heroin, surely I could stop drinking. When I read a blog, it was like the spirit of that person with me for the rest of the day. I would sometimes print out the blog or story and carry it around in my back pocket so that it would give me help and support during the day. And I knew I could always go back to Wired Into Recovery and find my more blogs and stories. You could see people would write parts of their story and all the supportive comments that went up, or there would be other comments saying, I'm in a similar situation. At one time, someone in Northern Ireland was threatening to commit suicide. It was very late at night and I spotted it. And I thought, what do I do? I put it up. Someone in Sydney responded and we started communicating with the person in Ireland because Sydney was many more hours ahead. It was just beautiful. Here's two of my buddies from Australia. Michael over there, 46 years in recovery. Been reading Daily Dose since 2002, and in 2008 and then been communicating with me. 2008 I sent a message saying, fancy lunch? And he said, you're on the other side of the world. I said, no, I'm not. I'm in Perth now, and my partner, she works just next door to your building. Adam, he wanted to come to the UK to see all the wonderful things that were happening in the UK, because nothing was happening recovery-wise in Australia. I tried my hardest to get into the system. I was invited to go and see the Governor-General, the most important person in West Australia. I put my suit on for the first time, sat in Government House with Malcolm McCusker and his wife sitting there, some alcohol honcho there and me here. So I'm having to go like this. First thing he says to me, you're not wanting to change anything, are you? I said, well, of course, it's not working. Eventually, I just realized I was wasting my time there. But Adam, these two guys were really pissed off. Adam said, I want to come and see what's happening in the UK. So he went to various places I recommended. He went back there. Nobody was interested at all in his agency. And they said, why don't you like us anymore? Why do you have to tell us about Britain? After 4 years, Wired Into Recovery had over 4,000 members from around the world. We had 1,000 bloggers. We had 7,500 blogs and 35,000 comments. Phil Valentine, who leads amazing recovery community in Connecticut, America, wrote, the Wired in online community is nothing short of amazing, but what borders on miraculous is this sense of true recovery transmitted through the internet. I feel his breast. I'll leave you to read that last bit. I woke up one morning, looked at her as I always did, but then I had someone I'd given more responsibility to, and woke up and I couldn't get in the website. I contacted my web guy. Fortunately, at midnight, he was up. we've been hacked, he said. I said, what can you do about it? He said, it's okay, we'll get back in. Got back in. The people themselves had left an email trail, left the emails on there. So we're able to see that this person, who I'm not going to name, I would just call her Susan, I know some of you actually know who it is, she had plotted to take over the site with some other people, one of whom was very senior in the field as well. And they started spreading rumours about me that I'd never done anything, I'd only spent a couple of £100. I'd spent about £70,000 on the whole project, and of course worked for free for years. So I was devastated. Fortunately, I was coming back to this country anyway to see my children. I had some great allies here who acted as moles, and we then decided, they stole the email list, which is actually criminal offence. So they then started to convince people to come to their version, so they then set up their own version once we took it back, which went nowhere. I wrote to 4,000 people and explained what had happened, and then explained I couldn't keep going on financially. So Widen disappeared. So I started doing something else, two things. First of all, set up a recovery stories website, which was now addiction and mental health, and started writing some stories and asking people if they would write stories. And some of these people came out from Wide into recovery. And so I launched this in 2013, and one of those stories written by the person himself is Simon. It still runs, but I'm spending most of the time on the Recovery Voices website at the moment. I then, X number of years later, asked people, I was getting a bit itchy for the field because I've been doing some other work, and I asked if we could do a 7-year update. And almost all the people said yes. And so I published an ebook called Our Recovery Stories, and you see in the middle there is Simon Jenkins. You did say to me you regretted at the time that you were busy and couldn't update, but your first story was so brilliant. Ian and Irene McDonald lost a son, and I'm very close friends with them, and they got into the field and set up a family support group in Cheltenham. There's Kevin Martin. Sadly, we lost Bradmere Phillips, who was at the Basement Project, dear friend. Beth Berger, some of you may know. Now all those stories are on the Recovery Voices website. I've got to give a thanks to this guy. This is my webmaster who's built everything other than Wide into Recovery. He's done all those websites for me. He lives in Kilfrew near Neath. He's the most amazing guy. It's Ash Whitney of Wired Up Wales. After the period when I decided that I couldn't go on in WA, Western Australia, doing recovery work, I started to get very interested in asset-based community development. So instead of always looking at weaknesses and deficits, look at what people have. Look at what people have in the community yourself. Look at all your assets and try and connect them. It's a wonderful approach. And I think you guys are doing some of it anyway. And I know James, when he heard this from Mark Gilman on a train back from Glasgow, he just absolutely got hooked. And those principles have been followed in developing what you have here. Find people with interests, skills or assets, connect them, connect to local assets, support people taking action, tell your stories, create a big voice, make connections across the neighbourhood. I just love this, and I know Cormac Russell quite well. In fact, he wrote a testimonial at the bottom of Recovery Voices, which was nice. This is where I went, though, and we're coming to a close in this half. When I got to Australia, I was really sickened by the level of racism I saw. And I wanted to know why. Why was this like this? And I read this amazing book called Trauma Trails, Recreating Songlines, which is about intergenerational trauma, by Judy Carly Atkinson. And I'll explain a little bit more in the second part of the talk. But basically, the Brits went into Australia. The colonisation process was basically destroying Aboriginal people, and I'll talk more detail in the second thing. So she outlines that, and that colonisation process and all the damage, the deaths, the diseases, the raping the women, destroying the culture, that's created a trauma that's gone down the generations. Second part of the book is about Indigenous healing practices, and there's Judy, who wrote it, and Carly, her daughter. They set up a program called We Arlie Healing Programs. I've met Judy, spent 3 days with her at an Aboriginal festival of sport and art and music and everything. Most extraordinary woman. This is what she calls healing. It's a journey of self-discovery as people engage together in educating themselves about themselves. Healing involves the processes of awakening to the pain of unmet needs and working towards having those needs met in reciprocal relationships with others. That's what you're doing. 6 steps, and I can't go into detail here. I nearly didn't have this, and I remembered it was advertised. I was going to talk about Indigenous healing, so I had to get it in. Create culturally safe places. The most important thing for Indigenous peoples around the world is to be connected to their culture. You see high suicide rates in cultures that have lost their connection to their culture. You see non-existent suicide rates in people in communities that have high connection to culture. So they create a safe place that's culturally safe. Actually, with Whitefella, maybe someone can tell me later today, what is our culture today in Western society? Find and tell our stories. Make sense of those stories, because when you're sharing and learning about someone else's story, you realise they've gone through the same thing and they may be further along in their journey. Feel the feelings. And I'll talk a little bit about this in the next part, but feeling the feelings, you sometimes have to do that when you've been traumatised, but you have to do it in a state when you're much calmer, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. We talked a lot about this yesterday in the meet. Move through the layers of loss and grief, strengthen your cultural and spiritual identity. What they do, they celebrate their culture, and circle group work, connection to country, and I've experienced the most amazing thing in connecting to an Aboriginal country. Food, or their bush tucker, storytelling, art, music, dance, singing, sound, breath, theatre, drama, bodywork, yoga, massage and mindfulness. And I'll point out in the next part of the talk why those things are so important. Here's a session of We Arlie healing programs. They've got some healing cards there. They've got art, because people sometimes can't express themselves in their words. They express themselves in their art. When they can't express themselves at all, then some of those breathing or massage techniques can help. I'd love to spend time on one of these 3-day sessions. I discovered this book a couple of years ago. This is the world-leading childhood trauma expert, Bruce Perry. I read 80% of this book in the first session of reading. I couldn't put it down, but then I had to go to the Indian restaurant. So I read the rest the next day and read it again and marked everything up. Extraordinary book. What happened to you? It's not what's wrong with you. It's what happened to you. It's much better. You don't go to the same place of judgment. I'm very cynical, having been an ex-neuroscientist, that psychiatric drugs do more harm than good. There's no relationship simple relationship between brain chemicals and neurotransmitters and so-called disorders. Anyway, what Bruce says, and I'm just going to allude to this briefly, I'd like to have said more, but there wasn't any time. He talks about this part of your brain here. Yeah, fine. Just about done. Thanks, Wolf. Your stress response system here, where all the information that comes in from everyone else goes in there first, not in here. This part then regulates that. This is your threat system, fight, flight, freeze system. So it's monitoring your body, it's monitoring the outside world. This then communicates here up to the cortex, and then there's feedback down below. It's very important that this system is working well. People who have been traumatized or had neglect or through poverty or disconnection, this system becomes hyperreactive. And when it becomes hyperreactive and you're triggered, and I've had serious post-traumatic stress disorder myself, and then the light bulb, when I read Bruce's book, what happens is your cortex shuts down. So you trigger, you can't think properly, or you do stupid things. Now, how do you actually calm this thing down? And the key thing is repetitive, rhythmic stuff, like drawing, walking, listening to waves, all those sorts of things. And amazingly, those are the things that Indigenous peoples cherish. So they're actually doing the real healing practices. And what Bruce says in relation to Indigenous elders, Western society has been destroying those Indigenous cultures, but actually they are the cultures that can help solve our problems. So it's a real irony. We've been screwing them, but actually we need them to help us get out of our mess. Last 2 slides, I think. I didn't know about this piece of research until I saw it. The most powerful form of reward is relational. Positive interactions with people are rewarding and regulating. This piece of research that Bruce was involved in, 70,000 people in 25 countries, showed that your history of relational health, your connectedness to family, community, and culture is more predictive of your mental health than your history of adversity. And that's pretty powerful. Connectedness has the power to counterbalance adversity, and I showed that with some data in the talk yesterday. And the last slide, I think, yes, it's the last slide. The key ingredient to effective healing involves using your healthy relationships. We heal best in community. A healing community gives you the opportunity to revisit the trauma, which you sometimes have to do, but you revisit it in a calm state instead of your normal reactive state. And then what that leads to is changes in brain function. So now I'm finding myself going back to brain function, but in a different way to before. Healing takes time, but you need a regulated stress response system. But the wonderful thing is you can shift slowly to being resilient. And that helps give you a unique strength and perspective. And I'll talk about that in the next talk. That journey can create post-traumatic wisdom. Thank you. Let's eat. Oh, I forgot one slide. This is the website. Hopefully most of you have seen it. If you haven't, that's the website that Wolf and I have set up, called Recovery Voices, and Marcus is in there, and James is in there, Wendy's in there, and I'm sure some more of you will be in there in the future. So, thank you again. I wanted to introduce you to some people here. This picture was taken in the 1940s, second half. It's Claude Kelly, Barry Lew, Parnell Dempster, Reynold Hart, and this young man, Revel Cooper, will feature quite a lot. So what happened is when I got to Australia and I was really upset about the racism, and I decided to explore more and learn more. And still trying to do the recovery stuff. I had a very good friend who was a filmmaker. We tried to raise money to start making film recovery stories, no way. And we started to hear about this guy, Revel Cooper. And one day Mike ran into his niece by total coincidence. And she said she'd got all his government records. Because she went, Aboriginal people could go and get the records that the government kept on them from the Department of Native Affairs. And when she got hers, a bunch fell off. And it was our Uncle Revel. So we had all this information about this guy. We're thinking about doing more research and making a film of him. I went round to an Aboriginal friend of mine one day, and Mike went into the loo. His name was actually Mike Lou, sorry. He went into the toilet. Mike Lou went to the loo, and he came out and he went, so I went in there, and there was an amazing piece of art sitting on top of the toilet cistern. So I said, Karen, why is there a Revel Cooper sitting on your toilet cistern? She said, well, go back to the back of the house, I've got no room. And then she told us a little bit about this story of Aboriginal child artists, and I knew there's going to be a teacher involved in a moment, and we knew that the teacher's daughter was still alive. And I went to meet her and we filmed her, and then she said, oh, you must meet my really good friend John Stanton. John Stanton was a social anthropologist from New Zealand, been living in Perth now 50 years. In Western Australia, no, in Australia 50 years. Been working with Aboriginal people for 50 years. He was head of the Burnt Museum, which was a major museum at the University of Western Australia with Aboriginal art and artefacts and everything. So I've met John, we started working together, and we built a website around this story, did masses of research. Mike went off and did something else. We never made a film of Revel Cooper, but we made this website, and then I wrote a book about this story, and I'm going to take you through this really quickly compared to the scale of the story. So the story starts with colonisation. So Aboriginal people suffered starvation, violence, disease, abduction, exploitation, taking of their land and destroying their culture. This is the longest lasting, continuous lasting society in the world, Aboriginal Australians, at least 60,000 years. In 1905, they created the Aboriginal Act. And what that did is it gave them greater control over Aboriginal people, could send them off to live on squalor on reserves, but most importantly, it started to take their children away from them. The idea was to make the children white. Now, with a lot of breeding with white people, gradually pure Aboriginal people were disappearing in number. And the philosophy was, they'll all die off anyway because they're weak, but we've got to make the half, the quarter, the eighth. They work to that sort of level. We must make them white. So what they did is they put them on what are called native settlements, and Carolup was one of those native settlements, and the kids lived in squalor there. The trauma which all these things caused just got passed down the generations, such that today we have one of the highest youth suicide rates in the world in Western Australia. We have a lot of them in prisons. There's a lot of domestic violence because when you've been traumatized generation after generation, you start lashing out. Who do you lash out against? The one closest to you, so your wife. At the same time, drinking increased, obviously. Whites sold the Aboriginals the alcohol. They never got prosecuted. The Aboriginal got prosecuted. Couldn't pay the fine, so send him to prison. So they learnt to drink fast, which of course amplified the problem. But when I actually did the research on this, do Aboriginal people as a whole drink more than white people? No, they don't, because it's a small number drink an awful lot. And the really strong members of the society are actually the women. Anyway, Revel Cooper's family lived on this reservation, on a rubbish tip, basically on the outskirts of Katanning. His mother died when he was 27. I got a photograph of the family. His father didn't want to look after them, so the grandparents looked after them. Government came in, took the whole lot over to Carolup Native Settlement. The grandparents had to live across the river because they weren't allowed to interact with the kids in the settlement. And the kids lived there. Immediately, 3 of Revel's family, the kids fell ill and the little baby died. They didn't go to school for 2 years. And Revel, I found this description that Revel wrote later of life in Carolup. So what I tried to do both for the website and the book is, because history is normally determined by the victors, and I knew this story would be corrupted. And in fact, there's a university that's got some art, it's all about the university. It's not about the Noongar, our local Aboriginal group called Noongars. And there's 250 Aboriginal countries in Australia. Anyway, so he wrote about what was happening, and he describes at the top here that the children were wild and out of control and everything. And then he said, we were locked in our respective dormitories at 5 p.m. winter and summer with no drinking water, and a sanitary bucket was placed in the centre of the room. Being afraid of the supernatural, we were afraid to get out of our beds at night. As a result, it started to smell a lot. The kids were sleeping on the floor as well. It was a really disgusting conditions. Here are the kids. This would have been about 1945. They finally had a teacher. There's Mrs. Elliott. There's young Revel. There's Parney. There's Reynold Hart. I met that lady all these years later, that little girl. I met her when she was older. Mrs. Elliott described the kids because the daughter of Mr. White, the main teacher who will be coming next, I gave me access to the school diaries, so I saw what she wrote about the kids as well, and she describes the kids. Practically all were likely to start a fight if any child looks at them at the wrong moment. They appear to lack understanding of each other. Whole mental attitude is too self-centered, and the inferiority complex seems very evident. They are intensely jealous of each other. They're only interested in the child inside them. Remember those words for what appears later. This is signs of traumatized children. Now, Mrs. Elliott realised she couldn't control the kids. She also had to put her children into boarding school. So eventually she decided she didn't want to do this job anymore. And she'd heard about this teacher called Noel White, who was working up north for a while with a whole load of Aboriginal families who still had their children, and he was doing very well with those teachers. And she said she went up to see him. I think by then he'd moved to a all-white school, and said, "Why don't you apply for this position? You would be absolutely perfect. These kids so desperately need someone like you." And he eventually agreed to do that. And Nolene, his daughter, explained how the car was, it's about 300 miles north of Perth, was put on a train and taken down to this. Carrolup is located about 120 miles southeast of Perth, right out in the bush. And so Noel took up the job as headmaster and the only teacher at the school. Here is Nolene White, who sadly passed last year. This is her when they were in Carrolup. It's her brother and her sister. They both passed a while ago. And this is what Revel Cooper had to say when they heard they had a teacher coming. "We had no idea when Mr. White would arrive, though we were all there when he did. We kept our respective distance. You see, we're all afraid of Mr. White." Sometimes they called him Mr. Whites. "And he moved about the settlement, so did we. For every time he looked round, they dived for cover. But the most important thing, as he said, the first week of school with our new teacher, we were all scared stiff. I think if it wasn't for the ever-present smile of Mr. White's, we would all stormed out of the school and run for our lives." They were shit scared of him. Now, it's really very interesting because everyone assumed that Noel White was Australian. And I managed one day to, every time I visited Nolene, I said, "Have you got your dad's voice?" So I wanted to hear him. Then one day she came running, "I've got it." And she started to put a cassette into the recorder, and I stopped her and I said, "We'll digitise it first." And then brought it back and listened. And my colleague, John Stanton, who'd been working on this for years, nearly fell off his seat because when Noel spoke, he spoke, "Well, I say to you now," oh, no, that's not very good. He was actually from British India, now Myanmar. He was Burmese. No one knew that. He'd gone to school in India. And a few years later, I found the old school annual from when he was in school in 1905 or something. And he's in the photograph. First day at school, rings the bell. Nothing happens. Keeps ringing it, and eventually the kids go there and they're all like this, and they're all really scruffy and snot running down their nose, according to Nolene. They were not looked after at all. Now, the big thing here is the Department of Native Affairs, they controlled the settlement. Mr. White was hired by the Department of Education, so he couldn't go in and get everything sorted out and the squalor in the rooms. All he could do is teach the kids. So, first week, not much is happening. He decided to go off and see an old friend of his who's the school inspector for the area, and they decide the only way to teach these kids is to get rid of normal education and start to work with the corroboree, the special ceremony Aboriginal people have, and maybe teach them things like dancing and chanting and things like that. And they agreed to do this. And at the same time, Noel walked along one day, and little Barney Dempster was sitting there drawing. And Noel said to him, "Would you like to do that more if I get more materials?" And Barney just went like that. Now, this was 1946, so there was a shortage of a lot of stuff, obviously, because of just after the war. What Noel did, oh no, first of all, Reynold Hart. Again, this comes from a letter that I have a copy of. The first year he came here, he found all the school children running around in the bush looking like savages. Then he started to learn us some music. He had a flute which he used to play for us in school. Then he saw we were keen on music and he started to learn us a few songs. The first song he learnt was Three Pigs. It wasn't long before he learnt us a big list of songs. I asked Nolene, did she have that? And she looked around, we found this old crate in her house, and there was this serial number. It was from 1879. And at one stage I was actually writing a film script for this story because I love film. And I acted out to Nolene. I said, we could have a scene with Noel on the flute dancing around. He used to do that. Anyway, so this is what he did with the kids. They did music, they did singing, they did chanting, they did corroboree dancing, and then into folk dancing. And there was a book written in the early 1950s about this, and it said they were absolutely awful at first. Storytelling, dramatisation, miming, and speech work. But what he used to do is he used to take the kids out into the bush. And he would say to the kids, I want you to look at what you see, and tomorrow I want you to draw it. Now, he wasn't an artist. So the kids came back and did some drawing, and they would go out again. And what he used to say is, he'd give feedback, and then he would say, look, you see the fence, it gets smaller in the distance. Take a look at it properly. Or he might say, that tree, look how the bark is. So he was giving feedback, but he didn't know his art. And the kids then started to help each other. They were starting to form a community. And they used to feed back. And John interviewed, my friend John Stanton, the co-worker, interviewed Parnell Dempster just before he died. And they said at one stage they used to cover their work up and then they would all reveal it. Now, there have been some arguments. So some people have said, and particularly some families say, no, Carol Up was all taught by a female artist called Bella Kelly. She was the one. And so people have tried to change the story. But Bella Kelly and her kids didn't go until 3 years later. But who can tell us who actually should take credit for this is the children themselves. We've got the original letters. How we, as boys, came to do such beautiful artwork of scenic and bush scenes is that we spend all our precious hours at school and weekends doing this work, and 3 years of this took our artwork to where it is today. And I say all honours are on Mr. White, who gave us the opportunity to improve our work. So the boys did all landscape art. The girls didn't do that. They did these sorts of designs, which later was an interesting aspect to that. But also, Mrs. White taught them, she got some sewing machines and taught them how to sew. And the girls made a whole set of school uniforms for all the kids. She was also in the kitchen improving standards there, but in the second year, she became the teacher of the little kids. So she couldn't continue doing that sort of thing. Now, sorry, I'm going to read a bit of a long thing here. Sammy Crabb, the school inspector, several years later, was asked by the head of the Australian Education Department, could he tell him what actually happened in that school? What was so special? And this is very important in terms of the way we teach our children now. Because I know it's the same here as in Australia. The education system is being fucked, excuse my language. So let's look what we've said here. The irony of this actually is the person who wanted the information was actually the president of the Eugenics Society of Victoria. So he actually, this is the weak race. And very few people knew that, and I just discovered it one day. Anyway, I feel that this is what Sammy Crabb said in a longer letter, the 4-page letter. I feel that to evaluate the artwork in its true perspective, we should see it as only one aspect of a school curriculum that used drawing as a necessary means of communication in almost every subject. I regard the children's love of singing, their choral work, dramatisations, and nature study rambles, etc., as part of the art development. I claim that the teacher who tried to link all of his teaching with the life and interests of these children must have developed an environment that helped to release the creative urge of these children. if they had been taught their special studies and skill subjects by humdrum methods, they would never have developed the spectacular work in art. The next stage was this stuff started to spread out. And first thing was, this is a famous Australian, Lord Forrest. I think he knocked off quite a few Aboriginal people over his time. But anyway, they celebrated his 100 years in 1947. And there was a competition organised by someone in the education department. All schools could submit short stories or pieces of art, drawings. And the best would be selected to go into this book. Perth's most famous school, Perth Modern School, had 5 pieces of work, more than anyone else. Second place was Carolup Native Settlement School, had 4 pieces of work. And 2 of those people, Vera Wallum, and if you ever read the book, you'll see she made the newspapers twice in the same week because she was involved in being beaten up by a teacher and ended up in court because she defended herself. There's Vera Wallum. She won a special prize given by the Institute of Surveyors and Parnell Dempster for a drawing. So already the kids were not just art, their storytelling was. Now it was reaching the newspapers. And here it says something, Mr. and Mrs. White might have discovered something that is going to improve the cultural life of Australia. And here it mentions it's not just the art, it's the schoolwork. And here is Revel Cooper's notebook. They're encouraged to do lots of drawing and then write things about history, animals. In this instance, it's cattle industry, dairy industry. This was Noel White's way of teaching the kids. And I've got a little film that we took at the Batty Library, is a sort of historical museum of Western Australia. And Mike Lew and I and Revel's niece poured through box files that someone had suggested we go to. And one set of box files led to someone else's records and things. So I had the actual school book and we videoed it turning over pages so you can see the whole thing. Given what was happening there, it was arranged that these kids would have their own art exhibition because they were part of one for the celebration, but now they were asked to have their own. And this took place in Bones Store, the most famous store in Perth. They had 450 pieces of art on display. The kids performed twice a day for the audience to see for 4 days. And here is the most important person in Western Australia, the Lieutenant Governor, Sir James Mitchell. Claude Kelly, Barry Lew, Reynold Hart, Parnell Dempster. Look how young they are. 450 pieces of art, all sold. And it's started to seep out. Some was taken back to Sydney. Here's a picture again, and you see how young they are. There's Parnell Dempster there. That's Sammy Crabb, the inspector. Now, Sammy Crabb organised a teachers' conference down in Albany, which is on the southwest coast. And they had teachers who would talk on their subject. So Noel White talked about the children's art. And the teachers refused to believe it. They said, "You did this." And Noel, I think, was a bit naive, actually. And Noel didn't know what to do. And Sammy Crabb said, "No problem. No, go back home, pick up 3 of the boys and bring them back." So the next day, 3 of these boys traipsed into the room, everything was set up for them, and away they went on their art. And the teachers were absolutely gobsmacked at what these kids could do. And then they put 92 pictures onto, public was allowed in, and they sold off 92 pictures, all going to help the art classes. Now, the funny thing about this, there's 2 of these pictures. I don't know if it was from whether those ones or were other ones that were taken down there, but I think 2 or 3 of those pictures were found in a rubbish bin. And someone I got to meet bought them from someone else. And so we've got these pictures. And the nice thing about this is we don't know which of the 3 boys did each picture. So there's no argument on us being able to show these, because all we need, you've got the various things with copyright, which my colleague John is a real expert with. But as long as we've got permission from the person who now owns it, then we can display this in any way. And this guy love seeing the pictures, shown at meetings like this. There's one of them. And apparently there's a description in here of how they did this, and I think they started with the trees. The people were really struck in the strange ways they did this. And there's another of these pieces. I love that one. That's a corroboree. And some of these pictures, some of the pieces of art, there's a load of heads there. And they're actually the boys looking at the corroboree. And Nolene actually got to see a corroboree once. There's Revel. Now, just put this up to show they were starting to winning prizes. That's a Revel piece of art there. And here's one of my favourite pictures. Nolene White took the photograph, so she's not in it. There's her brother and sister. There's Noel. There's Lily. There's Ronald Hart, Piney Dempster, Revel Cooper, Edie Smith. Edie Smith, there's a guy in Perth called Robert Eggington. He's a real activist, fight for his people. He had a photographic exhibition and we gave him a load of photographs to show in this. Nolene had been trying to get in contact with Edie so I could meet Edie. No, it happened. Then one day I'm at this exhibition looking and I hear this lady saying, there's Revel Cooper, there's Piney Dempster, there's Ronald Hart. And I walked up and I said, Edie, I've spent the last 6 months looking for you. And we started to talk, and I said, you know what? I've heard Noel's voice. She said, yeah? And then I put on my Indian accent. I have ancestors who were born, who used to live very close to where Noel White actually was born. I put on my fake Indian accent. She said, that's Noel, that's Noel. It was great. And she's passed now as well. Now, it wasn't just schoolwork, it wasn't just art, singing. They were singing one day and Sammy Crabb was there and left. And Noel White went out to school and said, are you all right, Sammy? And Sammy was crying. He said, I've never heard such beautiful voices in my life. But the boys, this is their Australian rules football team. There's Barney, there's Noel, Ronald Hart, Revel back there. Here's a newspaper clipping. It must be said for Carolup that they have developed a particular unique style of football within the Australian code. These lads were so fast and sure in this particular department that it would take a greyhound to catch them. In addition, the manner in which they kept the ball moving, their dodging tactics and their handball made it a pleasure to watch them in action. They were whopping everyone, locally. Then they were invited up to Perth by the teacher who had organised the John Forrest exhibition, and they played a local team. There they are in the newspaper thing. There's the game. They absolutely massacred the other team. £70 worth of money, which I'm not sure what it's worth now, I've forgotten when I calculated it, was just thrown onto the field in coins, and they got a tarpaulin and they just collected it all. So they then had a second game. They brought in some high school kids to beef up the other team. And it was the preliminary game before the senior semi-final, which had 20,000 people at. We're not sure how many people were at that preliminary game, but it was probably a significant number. Carolup won again. Revel, in that continuing letter, says, we weren't very good at cricket, although I found that they did win some games, he said, but at football, we were never, ever beaten. Right, now the story takes a new twist. This is Mrs. Florence Rutter. She set up the London Seroptomy group. Seroptomy is the female equivalent of Rotary. She came to Australia to visit her sister, came back a second time to go round the country to set up new seroptomy clubs or see how the other ones were doing. She got there and was sitting in a hotel and read this article about the Carolup child artist. She wanted to meet him. Fortunately, there was someone who lived in the town near to Carolup, Katanning, and said, if you can get down there on the train, we'll take you out. So she got on this rickety old train overnight, got there, taken out to the school, met the Whites, but most of the kids were out in the bush. It was a Sunday. But she ran into these two dudes. This is July. It's bloody cold in July in that place. You see she's got a big coat on. There's Ronald Hart, Parnell Dempster. They took her in to look at the art, and she couldn't get over how humble they were. There's a Reynolds piece. There's a Piney piece. So she asked the whites, could she buy £5 worth and take her with her to New Zealand and around Australia? And they said, sure. So she went round, did radio shows, the whole cadoodle. That was exhibited in Tasmania and raising money. They were collecting money, which eventually she took back to West Australia for the kids. So it got publicised all around Australia and New Zealand. She came back and then arranged a meeting with she contacted a politician who said, no, go and see the head of the Department of Native Affairs. She met Noel and Lily White, plus the new superintendent of Carolup, and they agreed that she could take a pile of the art over to the UK to exhibit there, sell, and send money back for the kids. So before going back, she went to see the kids again with a friend for 3 days. And I was given access to the diaries from her granddaughter, who moved to Perth and lives there. And what she said, in every way, the kids were exemplary, attentive, interested, appreciative, grateful, polite, unselfish, sporting, and physically courageous. I hope that my own grandchildren would develop these traits as definitely as these little Aboriginal boys. Contrast that with that first thing. And they were exhibiting crayons and paints, and she said, there's a real spirit of community life. They are non-possessive and quite definitely non-acquisitive. The older boys appeared to have pleasure in showing the younger ones what to do. Art supplies were rather difficult to get hold of. She bought some oil paints there. We think this is the first ever oil painting done in Australia by an Aboriginal person. That's Parnell Dempster. First exhibition, I'm not going to read anything from it, I just wanted to show you. First exhibition that she organised, she went to see her daughter in Holland and Appledorn, and they had an exhibition there, and there's a whole load of letters were sent by people, including heads of the Art Society and school teachers, sent letters to the children and to Noel and Lily White. We've got copies of those letters. I don't hold the originals. Okay. So Mrs. Rutter is back. She's had her first exhibition, and she starts writing to the kids, and the kids write back to her. Parnell writes, well, Mrs. Rutter, we received your fine letters. I was very glad with the news you gave us. Every letter you write, Mr. White reads out to the school children. We are very proud of you and what you are doing for us in other parts of the world. However, there's now a problem. The new superintendent doesn't like Noel White. And I've got records of arguments that went on, and finally this guy filed a complaint against Noel White. It's like hearing two different stories. I know which one I'd believe. Anyway, he stopped the kids doing art in the evenings at weekends. And they were due to be sending all the art to UK for money to be made, to be sent back to help them do their art. But the bloke stopped it. And Piney is telling Mrs. Rutter. She had her first exhibition in the India and Pakistan House, I think it was, something like that, in London. Here's two of the pieces of art. She knew all the society people in London, so there were a lot of well-known people who went out to see this art. And she wrote this because she heard about the stopping of the art. She wrote to the Department of Native Affairs boss and said, surely you can't be doing this, get it sorted sort of thing. She says, these boys, at least 50% of them would develop their technique and turn out pictures equal to Albert Namatjira, who was the most famous Australian artist, but the kids were known before him in London. And he can earn £1,500, which I think today is, and that would be per year, I'm sure. I think that's probably about £45,000. And Namatjira was taught by Rex Batterby, and he was 45. These kids were 12 to 14, basically self-taught. She's saying how great this is going to be. Now, there's one problem on all of this. Mrs. Rutter got in to see the slums in the buildings. And of course, she's not necessarily going to keep quiet about that sort of thing. Illustrated London News, first colour magazine of its type, published around the world, including in America. That's stuff about Carolup. Another newspaper. I've got loads of news clippings. Now, the interesting one. This is Reynold Hart writing to Mrs. Rutter, and she passes it on to the press. And it basically says, I'm really sorry, but this is not us. The fact there's no more art being sent. And now it's in the British newspapers. The Department of Native Affairs is getting A, more and more jealous, B, foreseeing there was going to be trouble because people would find out outside of Australia what was going on in Western Australia. And this didn't help at all. We're now in 1950. In September, Mrs. Lily White had a baby that died 5 days later. Parnell Dempster was sent away. The Department of Native Affairs pulled him, Reynold Hart, out of Carolup. They were starting to break it down. And then, without any warning at all, the school was shut down by the Department of Native Affairs. And now there's a whole saga, and there's a long story about this, and I've followed things over a period of time, but there's no time for me to describe what went on. What I wanted to do is show you a few things. Firstly, what Revel said about Noel White. He soon won our confidence and respect, for Mr. White was more than a teacher to us. This one man accomplished in a few short years what the department could do from now to eternity. Those kids absolutely love Noel, and Noel, according to Noeline, Noel and Lily absolutely loved the kid. And when the school was closed, they were totally broken by it. That's one of Revel's later paintings. But a number of interesting things happened here. Mrs. Rutter, back in England, got conned out of all her money. She was now broke. Someone from America, a Mr. Mayer, contacted her and asked if he could buy all the art and all the prints and everything else. And she agreed, and he bought it. And then the art disappeared. Nobody knew where it was. We knew he'd gone to America, and John had found out about lots of things. And he said I'd come out of America, and I was sure it was somewhere close. Meanwhile, that was Mrs. Rutter's collection. Of course, there's loads more in Western Australia. And he then got donated for the museum a whole large collection, I think about 120 pieces of art. And he put books out and put them out. The art went out on exhibition. I think it went on an 8-year tour, the longest tour ever. And John says, and he's an art expert, there's no children's art movement anywhere in the world like this one. Anyway, one of John's friends was only a few people who would know what's going to happen next. One of John's friends is in America, and he's giving a talk at Colgate University in upper New York State. And they said to him, well, if you want something on stage Aboriginal, we've got this box down there. We don't know what's in it. But come and have a look with us. And they opened it up, and there's a Revel Cooper painting on top. Now, hardly anyone would have, in that field, would have known, but because he was the best mate of Johnny and he'd seen the stuff. And in there was about 100 pieces of art. Some months later, it was arranged for John and 2 Aboriginal elders, Ezed Flowers and Athol Farmer. They flew over to America to look at the art. And it's really emotional hearing them talk about it. They asked to go down into the cellar to see the art on their own first, because they were so overwhelmed by what they were going to see. I've got film that was filmed at the time, and I've got it there on the website. And eventually, it was agreed that they would look after, treat whatever way was needed, the 20 best pieces of art, and send it back to Australia 56 years after it disappeared. And it was arranged that there would be an exhibition in Katanning, the town close to Carolup, in which people would attend. An incredible emotion. I've got films of it that John has got. Oh, it's just amazing. There's a little aside to it. Now, Wendy will appreciate this sort of thing. There was an American lady from Colgate who really wanted a big ego, and she wanted to be the one involved. And I heard via someone who knew a counsellor in Katanning The art, if it was going to come back permanently, would have gone to Burnt Museum at UWA. But no, this woman was apparently very jealous of John. She'd established an arrangement with another university, Curtin University, and then eventually went there, back there permanently. Now, at one level, that's great, because we've got the art in two places. So if one burnt down, we've got some of the art. But also, Curtin University, it was all about their ego. We're doing this, we're doing that, we want to raise 15 million for this and that. We were giving them stuff, Mike and I were giving them stuff at one stage, never got anything back. They don't recognise we exist, sort of thing. It's very sad. So anyway, the art is there in two places. What I will say is those kids were thrown back out, literally thrown out to find their own way to wherever. Several of them ended up prison. They taught other kids to do the art. And eventually what happened is the art developed through prisons. We have a great prison art movement. But let's look at what Noel White did there. What are our innate emotional needs? We need to feel safe and secure, feel a sense of belonging, connected to others. Noel told the kids to go and see the adults on the other side of the river. Very few of them had their parents there, sometimes grandparents, to learn about their culture. So he wanted them to connect to their culture. He connected them to the country. Reciprocity is you being in my heart and me being in your heart. Reciprocity. They had that. They had hope. They felt empowered. They had a sense of competence and achievement. Revel talks about how they were trusted, having meaning and purpose. And Parnell Dempster, and John talks about this on film, he said, Parnell Dempster said to him very proudly, we were the Carolup child artists, the famous. And they were loved. That all helped them to heal. There's no doubt that they healed, if only temporarily, until they were chucked out. And I actually tracked some of them down for a number of years, and that's all in the book. But what Bruce Perry, the American I talked about in the last thing, talked about, what Bruce Perry talked about, this part of the brain with trauma, disconnection, neglect, poverty, whatever, becomes hyperreactive. And that means also you're going to be more susceptible to things. How do you calm that down? You calm it down by patterned, repetitive, rhythmic activity. So it starts to calm down. What are those sorts of things? Music, sport, dance, drawing, walking in nature. That all calm that part of the brain down. So Noel White was actually using methods before the experts of today knew. He didn't know what that was, but smart dude. So finally, a couple of little bits. There's a picture of Athol and Ezard and John looking at the art. And as I say, I've got video of it as well. This is a lovely little story here. One of our aims was to connect the people of today to the Carolup children so they know what went on there. Cliff Ryder, it's one of his pieces. He actually arrived in 1950 when they moved kids from one native settlement, which had a lot of traumatised people, to Carolup. His kid, he died when he was 31, I think. His kids did not know he was in Carolup until the 1990s. I then got an email from one of them who asked me what else I had. I had a letter that Cliff Ryder wrote to Mrs. Rutter that says that he was originally at Moore River. His kids never knew that. They were so excited. They asked if they could meet with us, and then they arranged for us to go out to Moore River, and then they took us to their reserve where they lived when they were young, and we talked about Cliff, and I gave them all this stuff. I also managed to find a copy of the one book that was written about Carolup other than my own. This is from the 1950s, written by Mary Durek Miller, a very famous West Australian lady. There's Sharon Ryder, who we've got on film, but she hasn't given me approval yet to make it live. Her sisters and her brother. And that's their little brother who died as a child, and that's their father. And it gets even more interesting. I get another phone call from someone who says that her father was always angry about what happened to Aboriginal people. He visited every native settlement and reserve in Australia, and he went to Carolup. After it was Carolup, it became something else. But he was given a piece of Cliff Rider art, and they wanted to get it back to the family. And John happened to be going to Melbourne anyway, and he dropped by and told him how to get it preserved and everything else. And then she was ready to fly. Then COVID hit. 2 years later, she came back. And at that same graveyard, and I've got this all on film, she presented the art to this family. I'm filming it, John's filming it, and we're crying watching this. It was just so moving. So there's our website. Down here on the home page, you can click and get a PDF of an article I wrote for the Historical Society of Western Australia. Anyone who wants a copy of the ebook I wrote has all links or pictures, all the photographs, newspaper articles, art. We can't put high quality images on the website because we don't want people to make money from it, to put lower quality. So the ebook has got masses of stuff in there. Anyone who wants a copy, I mean, it's there for sale on Amazon and whatever, but I'm happy if you give your email address to James or whatever, I'll send you something from BookFunnel, which allows you to download it for free. John and I, every year we go out for Aboriginal Week. The first few times it was one day when we talked about Carolup. Last time I was out there, I did the trauma and healing that I did yesterday, a variation of it. The best, this is at the maximum security prison in Perth. The art class there, mainly Aboriginal people. It's the best audience I've ever had. And we go into the art class each time, and the atmosphere in there is just amazing. Totally healing. It's beautiful. Anyway, the last time we were there, they gave us presents, stools of art in all parts of the stool, most parts of the stool. And my one, I discovered Piney Dempster's grandson, who I call Piney Junior, was there. And he said, I'm going to do yours, David. Now, I don't know if he did, because when I went to get the stool, he was in court, and they couldn't tell me why. So I don't know, but I'm going to pretend it comes from a Piney. The Department of Criminal Justice, or what you call in West Australia, has never invited me down to go and talk to, run a whole course in that prison for others. It's very annoying. But we do have a project based on asset-based community development in the town nearest to Carolup, which is called Kojonup, a bit closer than Katanning. This young lady here is a children's artist and writer. She came to meet John and I and asked if we could do some work with her. We went down to see her. She was now in schools working with the kids with art. She was invited in and using regulatory activities with the kids. And the stuff that was created in just the first session was stunning. The kids are calming down. The school can't believe what's happening. At the moment, we're developing up. But she had an exhibition with 200 pieces of art. This is a group piece of art with this girl and a load of others. She was going to start writing grant applications everywhere, but we know they will go nowhere. And now some people have got really interested and have come to her. So I sort of act as a supporter and help her when I can. And we have, same with John. And we have meetings, and I really think this is going to be a huge project. Healing in community. Bruce Perry talks about pain into power. And I think I showed this in the last talk. We're just about there now. The journey from traumatized to typical to resilient helps create unique strength and perspective. The journey can create post-traumatic wisdom. Bruce says, when you have lived through adversity, you come to the point where you can look back on your life, reflect, learn, and grow from experience. I believe it is hard to understand humankind unless you know a little bit about adversity. Adversity, challenges, disappointments, loss, trauma, all can contribute to the capacity to be broadly empathic, to become wise. Trauma and adversity, in a way, are gifts. What we do with these gifts will differ from person to person. Some of you will work in the field, some of you will go elsewhere and lead your own life and a much better life. We don't make any judgments about what you do. This is so important. I finished with a story from Bruce Alexander. If any of you know him, he's the Rat Park man in addiction. And this is a native... Sorry?
We've come full circle from your rats to his, yes?
Yes. And you'll like this bit, I think. I think I may have told you this bit. So Bruce is talking with some native Canadians, similar problem there as Australia. And they say, these guys help people with addiction, mental health problems and everything, and they say it's like the people come flooding down the river like this, and we sort of grab them and we pull them out and we prop them up and we dry them off and everything, and some of them just fall back in and some of them go to the village, and it's great. And we celebrate that we've saved some. But some bastard upriver keeps chucking more of them in. And I thought that was so bloody good. And what Bruce Alexander talks about, he talks about we can have community recovery, like here. But we need society recovery. And you and I were just talking about it, Simon, that you guys, society, and Bruce Perry emphasises, so do all the trauma experts, society is fraying. We're becoming more and more disconnected. Empathy has been going down in young people, and lots of other problems. You guys have the solutions. And what Bruce Alexander says, this is something which will happen over generations, but it's not enough just to try and solve the addiction problem. These sorts of things need to link up with other social environmental initiatives around and together move the agenda forward. And you have so much to give. Now, in saying that, I'm very aware that poor people like James and Colin bust their guts to get where you are now and still need a hell of a lot more money. But at the same time, it's important to keep an eye on that outside world, link up with your assets in your community, and probably you'll end up doing better. But the other thing is of course, that gives the opportunity for you people who are in the community here, who are working in the addiction field, how about you may all be working in other fields instead, and gradually work towards trying to reduce the number of people coming down. I'm going to finish with a film. It's 3 minutes long. So there's a guy called Dilip Parekh who's become a very good friend. He's a very talented musician and he plays everywhere around Perth. He's incredible. And Dilip went to that exhibition that John organised in Katanning in 2006 and so moved by the art that he went to Kerala, which is total wrecked now. It's awful. It's heartbreaking. And Dilip was so moved by seeing it and hearing the story, he wrote a song. And one day he called me and he told me, I've written this song. Can I send you a copy? I said, yeah.
Out of town and far away, taken where they can't be seen. Wild flowers and walls a carol now. Little children, please don't cry. Rambling through the bush at night, shadow shapes before your eyes. Possum silhouette against the moon. Charred trees and kangaroos. Let the moon guide your way. Let the sun warm your skin as trees shelter your seeing eyes. See them old folk by the creek, hearing stories helps you see spirit lands of the south, unspoken but understood. Let the moon guide your way, let the sun warm your skin, as trees shelter your seeing eyes. Let the colors fill your room, let the shapes fire your mind, and the beauty of this land lives in your...
Thank you very much. Thank you.